It was a crisp autumn morning when Amy Wheeler struggled to maneuver her wheelchair through the parking lot of Fresh Foods Market. At 8 months pregnant, even the simplest tasks had become challenging exercises in patience. Her doctor had ordered bed rest due to complications, but they were running low on groceries, and her husband Tom was tied up with an important case at the FBI field office. The disabled parking spot near the entrance was a blessing she didn't take for granted. As she carefully transferred herself from her car to the wheelchair, she felt her baby girl kick, as if offering encouragement. Amy smiled, patting her belly gently. "Just a quick trip, little one," she whispered, adjusting her maternity dress over her bump. She had just finished securing her wheelchair when a shadow fell across her path. Looking up, she found herself face to face with Officer Richard Cooper, his expression stern and accusatory. "Ma'am, this is a disabled parking space," he announced, his hand resting on his belt in what seemed like an intentionally intimidating pose. "Yes, I know," Amy replied calmly, gesturing to her wheelchair and the properly displayed permit hanging from her rearview mirror. "I have a valid permit right there." The officer's face hardened. "You look mighty young to be using a disabled permit. Those are meant for people with real disabilities, not temporary conditions." His voice carried across the parking lot, drawing curious glances from shoppers pushing their carts to their cars. Amy felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment, but she kept her voice steady. "Sir, I understand your concern, but my permit is legitimate. My pregnancy has caused severe complications that affect my mobility. I'd be happy to show you the documentation." "Anyone can get fake papers these days," Officer Cooper scoffed, pulling out his citation book. "I've seen too many people taking advantage of these spots. You're young, pregnant, not disabled. You can walk from a regular spot like everyone else." Amy's heart began to race, and she felt a familiar tightening in her abdomen. The same sensation that had landed her in the hospital 2 weeks ago. Her doctor's warnings about stress and its effects on her high-risk pregnancy echoed in her mind. She took deep breaths, trying to stay calm. An elderly couple stopped nearby, the woman shaking her head disapprovingly at the officer's behavior. A teenage boy had pulled out his phone, quietly recording the interaction. Amy could feel sweat beading on her forehead, despite the cool morning air. "Officer," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "I respect your duty to enforce the law, but you're making incorrect assumptions. If you'd like to verify my permit's validity, we can do that through proper channels. But please understand, this stress isn't good for my baby." The officer leaned closer, his shadow completely engulfing her now. "Listen here, I've been doing this job for 15 years. I know when someone's trying to pull a fast one. You can't expect special treatment just because you're expecting. Rules are rules." As her anxiety mounted and another contraction gripped her, Amy reached for her phone. She knew she needed help, and thankfully, she had someone in her corner who understood both law enforcement and justice. With shaking fingers, she dialed her husband's number, silently praying he wasn't in a meeting. The pieces were now set in motion for what would become a turning point in local law enforcement's approach to disabled rights. But at that moment, Amy was just a frightened mother-to-be, trying to protect herself and her unborn child from unwarranted harassment. The phone rang 3 times before Tom Wheeler answered. Amy's heart leaped at the sound of his familiar voice, steady and reassuring even through the speaker. "Tom, I need your help," she managed, trying to keep her voice from shaking as another wave of discomfort washed over her. Officer Cooper's demeanor shifted slightly at the mention of a phone call, but he didn't back down. "Ma'am, putting your husband on the phone won't change the fact that you're violating parking regulations." Amy put the phone on speaker, her hand trembling. "Honey, I'm at Fresh Foods, and there's an officer here who—" she began, but Officer Cooper cut her off. "Sir, this is Officer Cooper with the City PD. Your wife is illegally occupying a disabled parking space, and I'm about to issue a citation." His voice carried an edge of authority that made several more shoppers stop to watch. Tom's response came through clear and measured. Officer Cooper, this is Special Agent Thomas Wheeler with the FBI. My wife has a valid disabled permit due to pregnancy complications. I can send you the documentation right now, but more importantly, I'm concerned about the stress you're causing her in her condition. The crowd that had gathered grew quieter, hanging on every word. The teenage boy was still recording, having been joined by two others with phones raised. A young mother with a toddler in her cart shook her head disapprovingly at the officer. FBI or not? Sir, the law is the law, Officer Cooper insisted, though his voice had lost some of its earlier bravado. I'm trying to protect the rights of legitimately disabled individuals. And I appreciate that dedication, Officer Cooper, Tom replied diplomatically. But right now, you're causing distress to a high-risk pregnant woman who has every right to use that space. Badge number 4479, correct. I can see it in the video being recorded by concerned citizens. Amy noticed beads of sweat forming on Officer Cooper's forehead, despite the cool weather. She pressed one hand to her belly, feeling another contraction building. The elderly couple who had stopped earlier were now speaking quietly to the store manager, who was hurrying their way with a concerned look on his face. Listen here, Officer Cooper started, but Tom's voice cut through with calm authority. Officer, I've just sent an email to Captain Reynolds about this situation. I suggest we handle this professionally. My wife's medical documents are on file with the DMV, which issued her legitimate permit. Meanwhile, she's showing signs of distress that could endanger our baby. Would you like to explain to your supervisor why you prioritized harassing a pregnant woman over verifying her permit through proper channels? The store manager finally reached them, slightly out of breath. Is everything okay here? Mrs. Wheeler, would you like to come inside and sit down? We have a chair in my office. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Officer Cooper looked from the phone to the growing crowd, to his citation book, and back to Amy's pale face. The sound of approaching sirens in the distance made everyone turn their heads. The day was about to take an unexpected turn, and Officer Cooper was beginning to realize he might have chosen the wrong battle this time. The approaching sirens belonged to a patrol supervisor's car, responding to the alert Tom had managed to put out. The sleek black vehicle pulled into the parking lot, and Captain Reynolds stepped out, her face set in a professional mask of concern. Amy was now sitting in a chair the store manager had brought out, breathing heavily through another contraction, while a kind elderly nurse who had been shopping offered her water and comfort. The crowd had grown, with many people still recording the scene on their phones. Officer Cooper straightened his uniform as his superior approached. Captain, I can explain, he began, but she held up a hand to silence him. In a moment, Cooper, Captain Reynolds said firmly. She turned to Amy, her expression softening. Mrs. Wheeler, I apologize for this situation. Are you all right? Do you need medical attention? The elderly nurse spoke up, her hand on Amy's wrist. Her pulse is elevated, and she's having contractions. Given her condition, she needs to see her doctor right away. Tom's voice was still coming through the phone speaker. Captain Reynolds, thank you for responding so quickly. My wife's doctor is Dr. Chen at Memorial Hospital. She's already been warned about stress triggering early labor. The store manager, who had been hovering nearby, stepped forward. We have security camera footage of the entire incident, Captain, and Mrs. Wheeler has been shopping here throughout her pregnancy. We've seen her permit and medical documentation before. Captain Reynolds nodded, taking in the scene. The gathering of concerned citizens, the phones recording everything, the visibly distressed pregnant woman, and her increasingly uncomfortable officer. Cooper, back to your patrol car. We'll discuss this back at the station. But Officer Cooper wasn't done. Captain, I was just following protocol. These spots are abused all the time. Protocol. Captain Reynolds interrupted sharply. Show me where protocol says to harass a visibly pregnant woman in a wheelchair without first verifying her permit through dispatch. Show me where it says to continue confrontation after medical distress is apparent. The crowd murmured in approval. A young man who had been recording spoke up. I've got the whole thing on video, Captain. He wouldn't even look at her permit. Amy winced through another contraction, and the elderly nurse's face grew more concerned. Her contractions are getting closer together. She needs to go to the hospital now. Captain Reynolds made a quick decision. Mrs. Wheeler, I'll have an ambulance here in 2 minutes. Cooper, you're suspended pending review. I want your badge and gun on my desk in an hour. The gravity of his actions finally seemed to hit Officer Cooper as he watched paramedics arrive and carefully help Amy onto a stretcher. The crowd that had gathered began to disperse, but not before several people had shared their contact information with Captain Reynolds, offering to be witnesses. This incident was far from over, but for now, the immediate crisis was being handled. As Amy was loaded into the ambulance, she could hear Tom on the phone coordinating with her doctor, and Captain Reynolds assuring him that this situation would be thoroughly investigated. At Memorial Hospital, Annie lay in a bed surrounded by beeping monitors, while Dr. Chen examined her carefully. Tom had arrived minutes after the ambulance, still in his FBI suit, his face etched with worry as he held his wife's hand. "The good news is we've managed to stop the contractions," Dr. Chen said, reviewing the monitor readings. "But this kind of stress could have triggered early labor. You'll need complete bed rest for the next week. No exceptions." The hospital room door opened, and 2 people entered, Captain Reynolds and a man in a crisp business suit who introduced himself as Mr. Wilson from the police department's Internal Affairs Division. "Mrs. Wheeler, I know this isn't the best time, but we need your statement while the events are still fresh." Tom squeezed Amy's hand supportively as she recounted the morning's events. Mr. Wilson took detailed notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions. His frown deepened when Amy described how Officer Cooper had refused to even look at her valid permit. "We've received the security footage from Fresh Foods," Captain Reynolds added, "and 17 different witnesses have already submitted their cell phone videos. The department takes discrimination against disabled individuals very seriously." Mr. Wilson nodded gravely. Officer Cooper's record shows 3 previous complaints about similar incidents, though none as severe as this one. All involved questioning legitimate disability permits without proper verification. 3 previous complaints. Tom's voice was controlled but firm, and he was still allowed to patrol alone. "That's exactly why I'm here," Mr. Wilson replied. "This incident has exposed a serious gap in our training and oversight procedures. We're launching a full investigation into not just Officer Cooper's actions, but our entire approach to handling disability-related situations." Dr. Chen interrupted gently. "I'll need everyone to wrap this up soon. Mrs. Wheeler needs rest, and her blood pressure is still higher than I'd like." Captain Reynolds stood up. "Just one more thing. Mrs. Wheeler, would you be willing to help us develop better training protocols once you've recovered? Your experience could prevent this from happening to others." Amy looked at Tom, who nodded encouragingly. "Yes," she said softly. "But first, I need to focus on keeping our baby safe." As the officials left the room, Tom pulled his chair closer to Amy's bed. A news alert popped up on his phone. Someone had already posted one of the videos online, and it was going viral. The comment section was filled with support for Amy and calls for police reform in handling disability cases. This incident was quickly becoming more than just a personal matter. It was sparking a larger conversation about how law enforcement interacts with disabled individuals. But for now, in that quiet hospital room, Amy and Tom focused on the steady rhythm of their baby's heartbeat on the monitor, grateful that despite the morning's chaos, their little one was safe. A week after the incident, the police department's conference room was packed with officials reviewing the case. The viral video had reached millions of views, drawing attention from disability rights organizations nationwide. Mr. Wilson from Internal Affairs stood at the front, presenting his findings on a large screen. "Officer Cooper's body camera footage confirms everything," he explained, clicking through time-stamped images. "Not only did he fail to follow department protocol, but his behavior violated at least 6 different disability rights statutes." The police chief leaned forward, his expression grave. "Show me the previous complaints." 3 more case files appeared on screen, each showing similar patterns. Disabled individuals questioned aggressively about their permits, all handled by Officer Cooper. Why weren't these flagged earlier? Captain Reynolds asked, flipping through the reports on her tablet. We had clear warning signs. A disability rights advocate who'd been invited to the meeting spoke up. This is unfortunately common. Many disabled people don't file formal complaints because they fear retaliation or assume nothing will change. These 3 complaints likely represent dozens of unreported incidents. Tom Wheeler, who'd been invited as both an FBI agent and Amy's husband, added his perspective. The bigger issue here is systemic. Officer Cooper's actions reflect a larger problem in how law enforcement views invisible disabilities. Pregnancy complications, chronic illness, temporary disabilities. They're all valid reasons for permits. The room grew quiet as security footage from Fresh Foods played on the screen. Watching Amy's distress and the gathering crowd's reaction hit home for many in the room. The elderly nurse checking Amy's pulse, the store manager bringing out a chair, the teenagers recording. It painted a clear picture of a community united against injustice. We've received official inquiries from the governor's office, the police chief announced. They want to know what steps we're taking to prevent similar incidents. This isn't just about one officer anymore. It's about rebuilding public trust. Mr. Wilson clicked to his final slide. Our investigation recommends immediate implementation of new training protocols, regular review of all disability-related interactions, and establishment of a community oversight committee. The discussion turned to concrete actions. They would need to revise the training manual, create new verification procedures, and build stronger relationships with disability advocacy groups. The elderly nurse who'd helped Amy had already volunteered to assist with medical training sessions. As the meeting wrapped up, Tom's phone buzzed with a message from Amy. She was still on bed rest, but their baby was doing well. The doctor was optimistic she'd carry to full term if she stayed calm and relaxed. This incident had sparked a change larger than anyone expected. What started as one officer's misconduct was becoming a catalyst for departmental reform, showing how a community's response to injustice could lead to meaningful change. 2 weeks after the department meeting, a unique gathering took place at the Police Academy's training center. Officer Cooper sat in the front row, alongside 20 other officers selected for the first session of the new Disability Awareness Program. Today's trainer wasn't a police instructor. It was Mrs. Chen, a longtime disability rights advocate who used a wheelchair herself. She wheeled to the front of the room, her presence commanding attention. "Before we begin," she said, "I want you to watch something." The lights dimmed, and the now famous video of Amy's encounter played on the screen. Officer Cooper shifted uncomfortably in his seat, watching his own actions from a new perspective. The room was silent except for the audio from the video. "That could have been me," Mrs. Chen said after the video ended. "That could have been your sister, your wife, your friend. Disability doesn't always look the way you expect it to." She pulled out a stack of permits: temporary, permanent, invisible disability, pregnancy-related. Each of these represents a person with a story, with struggles you might not see at first glance. Your job isn't to be medical experts. Your job is to protect and serve everyone, including those with disabilities. Officer Cooper raised his hand, his voice quieter than usual. "I always thought I was protecting disabled spaces from abuse. I never considered I might be the one causing harm." Mrs. Chen nodded. "That's why we're here. To learn, to understand, and to do better." She began sharing stories from her own experiences, both good and bad encounters with law enforcement. The officers listened intently, many taking notes. Meanwhile, across town, Amy was attending her final checkup before her due date. Her doctor was pleased. Despite the earlier scare, both mother and baby were healthy. The stress monitoring bracelet she'd worn since the incident showed normal readings. Tom had taken the afternoon off to accompany her. The department called this morning. He mentioned as they left the doctor's office, "They want to know if you'd be willing to record a training video once you're ready. Your story has already changed how they handle permit verifications. Amy smiled, rubbing her belly. Our little one's already making the world a better place, and she's not even born yet. The wheelchair-accessible van Tom had rented pulled up to take them home. As they drove past Fresh Foods Market, they noticed new signs in the parking lot. Disability rights are human rights, and all permits welcome. Questions? Ask inside for verification. Small changes, but meaningful ones. The incident that could have ended tragically had instead become a catalyst for positive change, one parking space at a time. 1 month after the disability awareness training began, the police department hosted a community forum at the local community center. The large room was packed with people from all walks of life: disability advocates, law enforcement officers, and community members. Among them sat Officer Cooper, looking both nervous and determined. The forum opened with Amy's recorded video message, played on the big screen. She'd filmed it just days before, holding her newborn daughter. Change starts with understanding. Her voice filled the room. What happened to me shouldn't happen to anyone else, but it led to something important, a chance to make things better. Captain Reynolds took the stage, presenting the department's new initiatives. Every officer would now wear a body camera with direct feed to dispatch when verifying disability permits. The department had also created a special unit focused on disability rights and accessibility issues. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. Officer Cooper walked to the podium, his hands slightly shaking as he adjusted the microphone. The room fell silent. "A month ago, I thought I knew what disability looked like," he began. "I was wrong. My actions could have seriously harmed Mrs. Wheeler and her baby. Since then, I've learned that disability isn't always visible, and it's not my job to judge. It's my job to protect and serve everyone." He turned to where Tom sat with baby photos on his phone. "I want to apologize again to the Wheeler family. Your grace in handling this situation taught me more than any training manual could." The community response was powerful. People shared their own stories of disability discrimination, but also their hopes for change. The elderly nurse who had helped Amy announced a new volunteer program. Medical professionals would help train officers about various health conditions and disabilities. The store manager from Fresh Foods spoke about their new policy. Any customer questioned about their disability permit could request verification inside the store, away from public view. Other businesses were adopting similar approaches. Mrs. Chen wheeled onto the stage to share the results of the first month of training. 23 officers have completed the program, she announced. Each one now serves as a disability rights liaison in their precinct. Officer Cooper has asked to join our community advisory board, and we've accepted. 2 months after the community forum, the changes had begun rippling outward. The police department's new approach was making headlines, with other cities requesting information about their disability rights program. Today, Tom and Amy were bringing their 6-week-old daughter, Grace, for her first public outing. The destination was meaningful: Fresh Foods Market. As Tom helped Amy from the car to her wheelchair, they noticed the parking lot had been completely redesigned. All disabled spaces now had extra room for mobility equipment, with clear signage about permit verification procedures. Inside, they found the store transformed: wide aisles, lower shelves, and a dedicated service desk for accessibility needs. The manager rushed over to greet them, cooing at baby Grace. "You 3 are the reason for all this," he said proudly. "Corporate saw our changes and is implementing them nationwide." Officer Cooper was there too, now assigned to the store's community outreach program. His face lit up when he saw the family, though nervousness flickered in his eyes. "Mrs. Wheeler," he said softly, "may I?" He gestured toward the baby. Amy nodded, and Tom carefully placed Grace in Officer Cooper's arms. The tough police officer's eyes welled up as he held the tiny infant. "She's beautiful," he whispered. "To think I could have." "But you didn't," Amy interrupted gently. "Instead, you helped create something important." She pointed to his new uniform patch, Disability Rights Liaison. It read in bold letters. Other shoppers began gathering around, many recognizing the family from the news. An elderly woman in a mobility scooter approached Officer Cooper. "He helped me last week," she told Amy. "When some teenagers were blocking the ramp, he didn't just move them along. He took time to explain why accessibility matters." The store manager brought out a cake, decorated with the words, "Thank you for making a difference." As they shared slices with customers and staff, Tom noticed something remarkable. The store had become more than just a grocery shop. It was a symbol of community change, where people of all abilities felt welcome and respected. 6 months had passed since that fateful morning at Fresh Foods Market. The police department's training center buzzed with activity as officers from across the state gathered for the first Disability Rights Law Enforcement Conference. Amy stood at the podium, baby Grace sleeping peacefully in Tom's arms in the front row. What started as a scary moment in a parking lot, Amy began, has grown into something beautiful. She gestured to the packed auditorium, where Officer Cooper sat alongside Mrs. Chen, both wearing conference organizer badges. The presentation screen behind her showed impressive statistics. Complaints about disability permit harassment had dropped to 0 in their city. Over 200 officers had completed the new training program, and 15 other police departments had adopted their model. But numbers don't tell the whole story, Amy continued. The real change is in the everyday moments. She shared stories that had poured in from community members. A pregnant woman helped with her groceries by an officer, an elderly man whose permit was verified respectfully, a child with autism treated with patience and understanding. Officer Cooper took the stage next, his transformation evident in his confident stride. 6 months ago, I was the problem, he admitted. Today, I'm part of the solution. He described his work with the Disability Advisory Board, how each interaction taught him something new about empathy and service. The store manager from Fresh Foods presented next, showing how their accessibility improvements had actually increased business. "When you make a space welcoming for everyone," he explained, "the whole community benefits." During the lunch break, Grace woke up hungry. Amy found herself in the newly designed nursing room, a space that hadn't existed before the incident. As she fed her daughter, she could hear the continuing conference through the speaker system. Officers were sharing experiences, asking questions, learning to see the world through different eyes. Tom poked his head in. "You won't believe who just arrived," he smiled. "Remember those teenagers who recorded the original video? They're here to talk about youth involvement in community change." As Amy walked back to the conference room, she passed the wall of commitments, hundreds of signed pledges from officers promising to serve all members of their community with respect and understanding. Her own words were displayed prominently. Change starts with one person choosing to do better. The day ended with a surprise announcement. The mayor declared their city the first universal access city in the state, committing to making all public spaces truly accessible. As confetti fell and applause filled the room, Amy looked at her daughter, now awake and curious about the excitement. "See that, little one?" she whispered. "Sometimes the hardest moments lead to the most beautiful changes. You helped make the world a little bit better, just by being you."